Oh hi, I'm the heretic.
And I'm getting videos copyright stricken by some fake production company which has inconsistent information about them everywhere online, from IMDb to the Library of Congress, with no website or contact info anywhere, suggesting that they're probably a front group for a larger state media company, or perhaps the state itself. And YouTube quietly did this without even giving me a notification, so I had no chance to even attempt to dispute this claim. On top of that, for the last 3 months or so, my videos have been shadow banned for pretty much anyone who isn't a subscriber with notifications turned on for my channel, as I'm getting literally no traffic after the last 4 hours outside of people from my Discord server on some of my videos, which has led to every video getting around 600 to 800 views, when earlier this year I was regularly getting 2,000 to 3,000 views per video. Clearly, YouTube has it out for me. Oh, and I'm SO. So, for those of you who don't know, I can't imagine that there are too many of you who aren't at least somewhat aware this has happened, since a propaganda campaign has been in the news recently on almost every single media outlet surrounding this subject, and for the last year or so, multi-million-dollar ad campaigns have been clogging the airways, every few commercials on every television network, and the ad space of almost every website one can visit.
Tonight, a new ad campaign hitting the airwaves and making its way onto teenagers' phones.
Vaping could lead to trying cigarettes.
TV, YouTube, Instagram commercials, all featuring a magic trick, turning vapes into cigarettes.
It's not magic, it's statistics.
The FDA rolling out the new PSAs this month aimed at getting kids to think twice before trying e-cigarettes. The FDA rolling out the new PSAs this month. The FDA.
But seemingly out of nowhere, the US government has proposed a bill which would criminalize the ownership of flavored vape fluid as a federal decree, and many states' governors, such as Andrew Cuomo of New York, have openly begun to forcibly suppress the legal trade of vape fluid. Now, I'll go more over the actual motivation which the state, along with the state's various cartelized business interests, have in forcibly suppressing the trade of vape fluid in a moment, but what you may have noticed about how this was proposed to the media is that this was the government just looking out for the safety of the people it claims to over. Yeah, so it should go without saying for our regular viewers, but any time that the government claims that it's going to forcibly suppress the legal trade of a certain resource because the politicians just care about the safety of the non-state actors that they claim to rule over, you should suspect not only that there's an ulterior motive, but that this was a hastily thrown together reaction to a perceived threat to the state's interests, that even within the state's own master narrative, the only justification that the state has for its actions is basically to just try and remind people that they're supposed to conceptualize the government as an organization which has the same interests they do, and that politicians are just trying to work towards their interests. The implication being that even the politicians know they're pissing people off, but that it's okay because the politicians are just being misled. That this is in no way politicians behaving antagonistically through overt hegemonic interests towards non-state actors in pursuit of trying to further the material interests of the state. Now, there are various reasons why this proposition is absurd and doesn't fare well when scrutinized. That material interests are marginal traits dependent on individual preferences and how each individual perceives their interest in relation to their preferences, and therefore the idea of a collective interest is itself absurd, let alone that a supposed collective interest can be met through the use of coercion via a monopoly on arbitration, which has absolutely no tangible means by which to be held accountable to anyone's interests aside from the people who run it, and that requires antagonizing the interests of non-state actors in order to merely function. That's not even to mention the practical problem of arguing that a few thousand people can manage the lives and interests of literally everyone better than those individuals can associating within mutually beneficial associations with other individuals. The fact that the argument of state-established licensing institutions being necessary for the sake of ensuring that commodities are functional and safe for its consumers has its premise rooted around a fallacious and conceptually inconsistent philosophical framework known as the strong precautionary principle formally, which has no means of being falsified within its own premise, as its premise rhetorically assumes the burden of proof or scrutiny rests upon the manufacturer of said commodity, thereby attempting to prove a negative, which makes it fundamentally incapable of being used to definitively demonstrate anything. Even assuming the reasoning behind the SPP, barring its conceptual framework, isn't logically inconsistent, which cannot be reasonably asserted even within its own presupposition, since according to the SPP, in order for a commodity to be proven to function as advertised by the producer, it has to be shown to the government to work and be licensed, which means a commodity created as an improvement to current living conditions can't come to the market in order for its effectiveness to be demonstrated, and therefore the SPP would need to be thrown out under its own standards. The fact that commodities like cigarettes or alcohol, just to name some of the products that most closely resemble e-cigarettes or cause similar effects to the ones which the government asserts e-cigarettes do, which can easily be found through just about any legal market firm that lead to diseases which untold thousands of people annually die from, are not only legally sold with little to no challenge from the state, at least not as of right now. Historically, the state has used coercion to forcibly suppress the legal trade of these commodities in general, but the state actually subsidizes various tobacco and alcohol manufacturers and uses force to suppress their competitors legally and financially in the aims of cartelizing those industries into a small handful of politically connected conglomerates propped up by state-secured legal privileges, by making it impossible to start competing in this industry unless doing so would benefit the state more than the state perceives it to cost. Meanwhile, there are only 6 people the state can point to who've been documented dying from a condition related to their vaping habits, and they only died because they used homemade vape fluid, which was mixed with some sort of synthetic compound that wasn't designed to be vaporized and sucked directly into a human's lungs, and not actually a result of the vape fluid itself. So that begs the question even further of why the fuck is the state even targeting vape fluid in the first place? But perhaps the biggest internal contradiction between the state's actual tangible interest and preferences contrasted by the framework the state and its media tries to construct and message as what its supposed stated preferences are is the fact that the U.S. government has directly killed more people and does so annually than literally any other cause of death, only rivaled by other governments.
The War of 1812 began after the British declared war on the US for invading Canadian territories. The number of deaths is around 22,200, entirely as a result of American government imperialism 20 years after the US Constitution was ratified. Many of the Founding Fathers were still alive at this point. President James Polk declared war on Mexico as a preemptive war to justify his imperialist lust to acquire California in 1845. The resulting war was another approximately 35,000 dead. The power confided in me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts, but beyond what may be necessary for these objects. There will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. This was spoken by Abraham Lincoln in his inaugural address, who threatened the now Confederate States of America with invasion and appropriation for failing to collect federal import tariffs. To avoid having to fight a war with the Confederacy over tax collection, and therefore make plain the idea that taxation is theft, the state invented the cult of the Union, to which membership was mandatory under penalty of murder. Freedom of association be damned. The War of Northern Aggression, colloquially referred to as the Civil War, resulted in 850,000 deaths. It's worth noting that the argument that the Civil War was about slavery was only used by the Northern aggressors 3 years into the war, when popular support in the Union was fading. 3,549 were killed in the Spanish-American War after a mysterious explosion sank the USS Maine, which was blamed on the Spanish, with zero evidence other than war-hungry US government officials who wanted to protect their business cronies' interests. The German embassy warned Americans not to travel on the RMS Lusitania, for there was an ongoing war between Great Britain and Germany, and any ship flying the British flag was liable to be sunk. Rather than replan their route, the Lusitania sailed into dangerous waters anyways, was sunk, and President Woodrow Wilson used it as an excuse to drag America into World War I. As a result, 117,465 Americans would die in that pointless war, including another 675,000 Americans who would still be alive but for the returning soldiers bringing with them the Spanish flu epidemic. And by the way, the Lusitania was carrying munitions, it was discovered. Now, we could conceivably blame the United States government for their involvement in the First World War that drove Germany to export and fund Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution to kick Russia out of the First World War. This would go on to cause the deaths of hundreds of millions around the world through the spread of Marxism, as well as causing the Treaty of Versailles to be written, which would give the eventual Nazi Party the mechanism by which they seized power, causing World War II, the Holocaust, and tens of millions more deaths, but we will never know for sure. As such, the US government is spared responsibility, however reluctantly. Speaking of World War II, the relocation of the Pacific Fleet in its entirety to Pearl Harbor was a deliberate provocation to bring the US into World War II. Even knowing well in advance that the naval base would be attacked, and the day they would be, the information was deliberately withheld from the Navy. The resulting tragedy brought America into World War II, which would go on to cause the needless deaths of 419,400 Americans. The Pacific Theater, in which the United States was heavily involved, caused the deaths of 3,100,000 Japanese, including civilians, in the bombings of Japan, as well as the pointless atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Before World War II, prohibition during the 1920s would not have been a thing, but for there being a government with which authoritarian-minded busybodies may institutionalize their malevolence. Most infamously, in an attempt to discourage illegal drinking, the state deliberately poisoned industrial alcohol to discourage its making into alcoholic beverages. The result was an estimated 10,000 dead. The withdrawal of US support for the Chinese nationalists in the Chinese Civil War is arguably what led to the victory of the Red Chinese and the rise of Mao Zedong, which would lead China to slaughter and mass famine, resulting in approximately 80 million deaths. However, for this one, I'll give the US a pass, if only because there's no guarantee what the outcome would have been had they stayed. Besides, it's not the US government's role to meddle in foreign affairs anyway. It's the role of the government to cease existing. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which the US lied about the USS Maddox being attacked twice in order to justify war in Vietnam, resulted in the deaths of millions. It's hard to say how many total. Estimates range from 1.3 to 3.9 million. We know 58,220 Americans died, but the number of South and North Vietnamese and Cambodian deaths is in dispute. To be generous, let's just say 1,300,000 as a result of yet another US government lie. Now that's a lot of deaths so far, but you ain't seen nothing yet. Rachel Carson is a name that should be a byword for mass death by famine. Her book, Silent Spring, inspired the banning of the pesticide DDT in the United States in 1972, which put pressure to have it banned around the world. As a result, there has been a resurgence of malaria, leading to the deaths of approximately 60 million people from a disease that was on the brink of total eradication. In 1973, the Supreme Court legalized abortion in the United States. While it's not the government's business to ban things, even if that thing is hugely unethical, they subsidize abortion providers like Planned Parenthood for over $500 million a year. Easily their largest revenue stream. Meaning the 60,069,971 babies who were murdered by abortion since 1973 as of January 2018 is on the US government. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attack was done with funding and training from Saudi Arabia, and despite the US government's blatantly obvious cover-up of Saudi cause, they can't be blamed for those deaths. What they can be blamed on, however, is the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The former was done simply because Saddam Hussein stopped trading his oil in petrodollars in 1999. The latter because former CIA asset Osama bin Laden had allegedly gone rogue and needed to die. Deaths for both conflicts, including operations in Pakistan, reached 507,236 total deaths. Of course, we can keep going. The number of deaths from government economic restriction, like life-saving drugs that were prevented from entering the market by the FDA. Car crash fatalities increased by CAFE standards, which makes cars more fragile in an accident and therefore the drivers less safe. Fatal shootings by cockroaches. I could go on, but look at this number. Does the organization that is responsible for the deaths of roughly 127,109,821 people, the kind of organization that cares about 6 people dying from e-cigarettes? Or does that sound like the organization that only wants to ban flavors of vaping fluid to protect their friends in big tobacco from competition, the same industry whose product is responsible for 480,000 deaths a year? I'll let you decide.
And that figure's not even getting into all of the indirect ways in which it can reasonably be argued that the state, in using force to satisfy one or more of its material interests, ends up resulting in countless deaths, e.g., the state's cartelization of the pharmaceutical industry through the use of licensing laws, finance manipulation, and patent law, among other forms of regulatory capture, creating an artificial scarcity of medicine, hospitals, doctors, medical equipment, and innovation regarding how these products are produced, along with diversity of how they can be produced and traded, which has resulted in pretty much every death that's occurred because of starvation, disease, social stigmas created by dysgenic cultural influences the state has on society through either deliberately trying to manufacture antagonism between people of different descriptive identities, or by the conditions in how people in general internalize society around them because of some legislation that influences social interaction, or the mere concept of centralized legislation weaponized against people to manipulate their behaviors, etc. Or how about the state setting up all these drug cartels in Southeast Asia, as was revealed in the Phoenix program, or more recently in Mexico, with it being openly on record that the Los Zetas drug cartel, among others, were started by the CIA? Or how about child sex trafficking rings, which are run out of Child Protective Services affiliated foster homes, and CPS is directly incentivized through federal government loaning programs to take as many kids away from their families as possible every month and put them into these homes? Or how the state pushes various pseudo-scientific fields of research in academia, such as psychiatry, in order to create a perceived legitimacy for these studies, since doing so would expand demand for various industry cartels created by the state. The list could go on, but we're not grouping those in with direct deaths, since because deaths resulting from one of these indirect and structurally incentivized means of state manipulation aren't concise specifically by design, as the CIA on numerous occasions, whether it be William K. Casey testifying to Congress about Operation Mockingbird, or Alan Dulles literally coining the term plausible deniability, that the state manipulates geopolitical events, media, industry, and pretty much anything else the state feels it needs to influence by working through as many proxies and front groups as the state perceives to be cost-effective in order to pretend that the US government isn't the factor responsible for any wrongs which may or will come as a result of that state meddling. That's why these associations are hidden, well, usually behind many proxies, manipulations that are unrelated to that specific area of society, e.g. finance manipulations influencing the behavior of market actors, like in the case of Operation Choke Point, licensing boards, or NGO political interest groups. Consequently, there's no real way to tell how many people have actually been killed because of this, and the metric itself to measure by is debatable because there are so many factors at play here. The point is, though, that if you honestly are going to argue that politicians are motivated by trying to serve your interests, then you have to omit so many documented facts, so much empirical data, so many logical conclusions which can easily be reached by observing the state's incentives along with what factors motivate and have historically motivated the state to operate towards specific conclusions it comes to in regards to what it perceives its own interests to be, that you would have to structure any arguments in support of this position based on internal reasoning and framing which is completely disassociated from observable reality. States don't produce any resources, so states need to coercively appropriate resources from the population they claim to have dominion over, or need to parasitically appropriate them through another means, though the most consistent is through coercion, creating a direct structural incentive to antagonize the material interests of non-state actors, along with an inherent need to do so. The fact that governments operate around exponential growth curves and are consequently incentivized to expand their influence over society overtly through cartelization. Governments killing and torturing ungodly amounts of people throughout even the last century, much less all of recorded history, just to have their perceived material interests met, all while demonstrably causing greater amounts of poverty and slowing down material progress along with social development in the process. The fact is that as long as governments exist, these will be their effects on the societies they occupy, and that's incredibly easy to prove. I mean, for fuck's sake, within less than a week of the vape fluid ban, the FDA just approved the sale of candy made from Adderall intended to be prescribed by doctors to children who of course work within the state's cartelized pharmaceutical industry, the chemical compound of which is nearly identical to methamphetamine. So, as Filthy and I have clearly shown, the stated explanation for this from the state cannot possibly be true. Being that this is the case, you may be asking, what exactly is the state's motivation behind this vape ban? Well, it's pretty simple, really.
Producing vaping fluid is so easy, an amateur can make it in their own house with ingredients they can buy at a grocery store. Anyone can become a vaping fluid vendor. Sure, big vape vendors can exist, but when startup capital is not even $50, there's gonna be lots of competition. The state can't do anything about it either, because if they raise the price for nicotine or flavor additives, that's just gonna hurt everyone, especially their friends in big tobacco, which means less political donations and lobbying fees from big tobacco. As such, the state can't cartelize the vaping industry into 2 or 3 megacorporations that owe their existence and therefore their eternal allegiance to the state, like they did with the tobacco industry. This is the impetus for the ban. Vaping and e-cigarettes were outcompeting big tobacco and had to be squelched. It's no coincidence that after the proposed ban, people have been turning back to cigarettes, giving revenue to big tobacco, which in turn gives revenue to the state. Certainly, not all vaping is banned. You can still inhale nicotine because that's tasty to people for some reason. But the iron law of prohibition guarantees that harder vaping fluids will be available on the black market, which will be more dangerous. The number of vaping-related injuries and fatalities will increase, and this will give justification for the moral reformers to ban all vaping and e-cigarettes. Classic problem reaction solution. The only reason anyone died from vaping is because additives were put into vaping solutions that aren't meant to be vaporized, like vitamin E for instance. You can avoid this by either making the vaping fluid yourself so you know exactly what's in it, or you can simply not smoke at all, not even cigarettes. Anyone who thinks the state is just trying to help with their proposed flavored vape ban, or in the case of Michigan and New York State, actual ban, well, you're beyond saving. It's not just that your interest in the states conflict, they hate you. They hold your existence in contempt and loathe that they have to pretend that your and their interests coincide every 2 years or so. One need only look at the very conservative mountain of corpses the US government is directly responsible for to see in what regard they hold your life. Questions, comments, critique? Do you vape? Do you employ the sensible solution and just don't smoke at all? Leave a comment below. Support me or Esso on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.